like Astrid said, I'm Don Ford from a postdoc at the University of Bremen. And yeah, it's an honor to be invited, especially because we haven't met in person before. So it's really nice to meet you in person and to kind of see everybody here. So it's great. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the program. But yes, let me get on with it. Yeah. So are digital games escapist? It's kind of one of these questions that as games researchers, or as a games researcher at least, I often have kind of dismissed in the past as like kind of ignorant and dismissive way of viewing games, right? But I think it's worth reconsidering this notion of escape because of what it tells us about how we use, construct, and perceive game worlds. Just as Le Guin famously remarks here, and as Tolkien and other fantasy writers have remarked, there's another way of thinking about escapism, that it tells us more about the world we are supposedly escaping from, that it can be a good and even useful thing. And then also more theoretically, I'm interested in this increasing trend of removing conceptual boundaries. So there's a great deal of research in game studies and media studies and many fields, right, that ask us to look past the arbitrary boundaries between, online and offline, game world and real world, inside the magic circle, outside the magic circle, right? And these kind of researchers have rightly pointed out that things are never as separated as they seem, of course, or as we may want them to be. Our contexts and our circumstances always come to bear on our play activities, and what happens inside the game is not contained only to the game session, right? We know this. We can make these links all the time. A great example from my lab head, Kerstin Preda-Anpfeiler uses, is from this Catholic magazine, Crux. It writes positively and hopefully about what is by then a 5-year-old video game, and it's a video game from a series that has you like fist fight the Pope, and the Pope who's using a mind controlling device, right? So even if it didn't actually work out as the headline suggested, it kind of really shows this amazing confluence of game development technologies, digital game worlds, real world disasters, well, even there, I've just done the separation, real world disasters, and material Christian interests. And it shows that why, in true Assassin's Creed fashion, everything is connected. But if that's the state of things, then why is it that we have to argue in the first place for tearing these conceptual boundaries down? I think before tearing these walls down, or maybe it's a bit late for that, I think it's useful for us to ask why those walls were erected in the first place, or kind of what the impetus behind them is. And I think it's not an accident that we make these distinctions. And I say we here, maybe it's just me, but even in class, even knowing all this, I kind of struggle when talking to my students about how, like, oh, in the real world this happens, and in the game world this happens. It's really difficult to escape this. And I think it's worth considering how and maybe why we make these kind of separations and demarcations. So I want to approach this with lessons I've learned from looking into folklore studies, in particular this a Finnish folklorist called Frog, who I suppose is a colleague of yours at Helsinki. Not sure if you've come across him, but yeah. So in folklore, very, very broadly speaking, we're talking about different ways in which societies, communities, folk understand and relate to the world around them. And this includes a broad concept of what gets called or categorized as other worlds. This can include, all sorts of things like heaven and hell, fairyland, spirit realms, and so on. But Frog kind of points out a pretty obvious problem here. Oh, wait, yeah. So are other worlds separate from the empirical world? Is that a distinction we can make? Well, sometimes, but sometimes not. You'll find the Garden of Eden on medieval maps, and in Irish traditions, he points out that it seems possible to kind of wander in and out of the other world, and sometimes the graveyard is in some cultures kind of perceived as a village of the dead that you can in which one can visit the dead kind of at will. It's not really separate from the rest of the world. And he also stresses that the label of otherworld, or the perception of it as supernatural, can also be problematic. So Christopher Columbus describes the continent he discovered across the Atlantic as an otro mundo, right, as an other world, which probably isn't a description of their world, if it would even be considered one that the indigenous inhabitants would agree with. They wouldn't call themselves the other world in that sense, right? So the heart of the problem is that there is no inherent otherness that makes any space an other world. And this won't be an unfamiliar argument, because of course we use the same logic to talk about the othering of people. There is no other trait. There's only the creation of an othered group by another. Frog does point out that othering is not always or exclusively applied negatively or wholly negatively. That's just the kind of rightly is the predominant mode that we kind of critique it from. We also other, he says, rock stars, nuns, and world leaders, saints, angels, and gods. These are all kind of othered kinds of beings in some way, which is either a wholly positive or at least ambivalent kind of depiction. And arguably this can cut this and arguably this happens even this ambivalent or positive depiction can happen even more with space. Not better or worse, you know, they can be unambiguously good like heaven, or ambivalent like not better or worse, just different, maybe more dangerous or something like that. And these two modes of othering people and othering spaces are also often inextricably linked. So we form these tautological mythologies about people and places. This place is evil and therefore its inhabitants are, or the inhabitants are evil and therefore the place is Mordor evil because it contains more orcs, or are orcs evil because they're in Mordor. Tomasz, don't come at me. This I know. It's just an example.
You could use another example.
True, but I couldn't think of one. So in following this whole line of thought, Frog argues that it's helpful to stop perceiving the other world as a noun and instead view it as a verb, right? The point is that when we're studying it, it can matter less what the other world is and more how and why it was created, and what the processes of negotiating and maintaining it are. So otherworlding, he says, is the othering of space. And what else this conceptual shift to otherworlding as a process does, it broadens it out really quite a lot. So yes, we can think of otherworlding as this creation of spiritual realms and mirror worlds and the afterlife and so on, but we can also see it at work in much more mundane or profane contexts. So examples that Frog gives is for example, the emperor's palace. The grandeur layout of the space confers certain ideas about who has what status, who has what power. A teenager's bedroom where the whole space is kind of depicted or kind of revolves around reflecting a personality and conferring certain values about who's welcome there. Or going to a grandparent's house, how it can change, sometimes subtly, sometimes quite radically, the social relations that are at play. Like a parent becomes a child, they take on that role. Child becomes grandparent. Things often work a bit differently. These can also be more transient and time-based, like a rave, sex club, mosh pit, a festival. And the point is that these can all be linked in the fact that we are intentionally using and manipulating space as a way of enforcing and changing values, relations, hierarchies, emotions. That's nothing new. We want to have spaces in which things work differently. We wouldn't want our entire life to have the same rules as a mosh pit, but we do want that sometimes. And this can be for many reasons, right? As a way of trying out different or new values, exploring different parts of ourselves, escaping roles that we have in other parts of life, but which can be tiring. And fictional worlds are no less interesting from this perspective. They tell us just as much about the society who created them, even if they are not then imbued with the same belief or integrated into broader social systems of ritual and practice and so on. So this is not to equate them in this sense, but it is to say that fictional worlds read through this lens of otherworlding are also a rich site for exploring societal values. And the salience, integration, and the kind of strength of belief in another world depends on how it is mythologized. Mythologization here refers to establishing models for understanding the world and things in it through discourse. Other worlds are both created and informed by discourse, and can also then be used in further discourse, further mythologization. Like the idea of utopia and dystopia is a key example of this, where you create an otherworld, a fictional otherworld, in order to advance an argument to kind of maybe to make natural the idea that such and such a potential world is inherently good or bad, and this has implications for what we should do to reach it or avoid it often. And I would argue that games are no different here with regards to otherworlding and mythologization. Game worlds, both single player and multiplayer, can be understood as otherworlds, created as a way of instilling a separate place with new values, relations, and customs. The question is then whether there is anything special about games in this regard. And I think there are a number of commonalities about games that make them interesting in this context of otherworlding and might kind of lead us to an answer as to why games are appealing and for why we might want them separate from other parts of life. Philosopher Sitai Nguyen makes the point that outside of games, much of the pain and difficulty of social life with others arises from the dizzying plurality of values. Each of us cares about different things. Trying to mesh the plurality of disparate values into livable communities is incredibly difficult. However, he says, in games, values are usually singular and shared. Each person is a simplified agent. In most cases, competing agents pursue the same goal. When we are playing tennis, we don't have to cope with subtle differences between your and my view of the good, right? We're after exactly the same thing. We're not cooperating, he says, but we are motivationally coherent to one another. And he says that he argues that this can be even more apparent in digital games, where in Super Mario Brothers, for example, we're given the ability to run and jump and a world full of chasms to jump over and monsters to jump upon, right? So, and what's more, he says our jumping abilities and speed are just barely enough to cope with the chasms and the monsters we face. So imagine if we played Mario, but the chasms we faced were kind of too wide for us to make it across. It would be a pretty unsatisfying game. But life is full of such metaphorical chasms. It's full of situations that are not made for us and our abilities, where it's not clear if we can accomplish our goals at all. So by and large, games offer us clear shared goals that are commensurate to our abilities, and this kind of alignment is one of those really satisfying things. But then digital games create this entire world upheld by this other entity, as the computer, in which this is the case, in which the whole world is commensurate to your abilities and it tells you what your values should be in this world. This is not always good. This whole idea of value clarity and also the idea of this in games. Nguyen warns also against the seduction of clarity and the notion then of value capture. And how he says this goes is like this: our values are at first rich and subtle. We encounter simplified, often quantified versions of those values. Those simplified versions take the place of our richer values. Our lives get worse. So he applies this notion to games, but also to sort of gamification and bureaucracy more broadly as well, right? So he says you might start to use a fitness tracker like Fitbit for the sake of your health, but over time you come to just chase high step counts, or you might go into academia for the love of wisdom and truth, and you come out of graduate school valuing only publication in high status journals and measurable research impact factors. Can relate. But this can also apply to the more derogatory view of games as escapist as well, or even these kind of slightly dodgy notions of video game addiction as well, that you stop caring about the real world so much, right? And because your values have been replaced by the game values and so on. So this value capture is not inevitable, but it is a possible consequence of value clarity. I didn't know what to have as a slide here, so this is my cat. So as I mentioned, value clarity and value capture don't only apply in games, right? So they also apply in bureaucracies and so-called gamified activities. Any system in which there is an attempt to streamline and coordinate values. Data and datafication then as a concept kind of do this inherently, and the effects of data's increasing encroachment into society have become quite significant. So to kind of start this last bit with my overall hypothesis, it's that digital games give us one of the few forms of datafication that add to rather than take away from our values. This sounds quite romantic and naive, and it definitely is. But hopefully there's a provocation here or some food for thought, right? So essentially my argument is that in a context of datafication, which I'll get into in a sec, games offer us an escape from the alienating effects of data, even as they are, of course, ironically, pure data themselves, essentially. And because of this, then, there is an urge to insulate games from the rest of this context, to construe them as an otherworld. So I'll explain I had the procrastination and animations, it's great. So I'll explain this context of datafication first, right? We're probably all quite aware of datafication and the effects of it by now, right? But for me, the salient part of it is that datafication works hand in hand with these ideas of value clarity and value capture. Again, we come into academia seeking truth for knowledge, and we end up chasing H indexes and citation scores, right? These are data points that try to reflect nuanced and complex values, like how many people are engaging with your work and how many people are engaging with your whole body of work rather than just one of your particles. But these data points can end up replacing those values entirely due to the incentive structures, right? Reducing something to a data point is always a reduction. I always like to think of this through the metaphor of the difference between analog and digital signals, right? So it's a sine wave, and for example, when we digitize a song, it has to at some point become ones and zeros, right? You can have many, many more of these digital lines to better approximate an analog curve, but you can never get there. So datafication then describes how our mediatized world has come to more fundamentally rely on and be founded by data, or founded on data. It's value capture on this kind of gigantic scale. We have become datafied subjects, where as persons we are increasingly constituted and acted on as data rather than through or with data. And the effects of this can be seen, for example, in Google and SEO. So people are increasingly noticing that Google has gotten worse, not better, in recent years, so-called intuitification. And a big part of the reason for that is search engine optimization, which has meant that the internet is no longer really designed for us as people, broadly speaking. It's designed for robots. It's data-driven design used to manipulate data-driven algorithms used to generate data for targeted ads. And we're at the very, very end of this long line of robots passing data between each other. It's also encapsulated by the, I think, quite evocative dead internet theory. It's a conspiracy theory that the internet is now populated predominantly by bots, automatically generated content, and algorithmic curation. As the author of this Atlantic article argues, it might not be literally true, but it definitely feels like it's true, and it's only becoming truer. So then many have argued that this context of datafication that results in this is from a Marxist perspective alienating. So Michael Steinman here argues that we produce and use personal data on the internet as a way of asserting our reality over the long distances of the internet and negotiating the reality of other human entities. I convert my words and my thoughts and my feelings into data on a messaging app, and I send that data to a friend. They interpret that, they send it back, right? And this gives us a kind of digital approximation of talking. Might be a pretty good approximation in most cases, but in other cases not. We're always losing something. But when our production of personal data additionally or even instead becomes a resource for others, and then becomes further abstracted like the SEO example, we feel further and further from that social connection, from the assertion and recognition of our existence, and from whatever it is we were trying to do with our rich and nuanced values. So where do games come into this? Because in many ways, we can think of digital games as this notion of datafication taken to the extreme. To inhabit and act in a game world, in a digital game world, I have to become wholly data in a world of data, completely reducible to code and digital assets. This is where I think the ideas of otherworlding and escapism and boundaries come into play here. Again, my argument is that digital games offer us datafication without the alienation as a slogan, especially in this context in which datafication seems increasingly alienating. A game world can be an other world in which the computation and digitization of our identities and our personalities is recognized, reflected, and integrated in a world in which values those values, yeah. Rather than perverts or thwarts them. And this underscores that datafication isn't necessarily bad in and of itself. This goes back to the idea of value clarity, right? We're Mario in a world full of Mario-sized platforms. In a digital game world, the datafication of our actions allows for this entire world, which is commensurate to our abilities, and in which those abilities are given meaning. So this is going to be my violently bad diagram. So the comparison is this. When I Google something or use a social media platform, I have my own personal motivations and reasonings for it, right? To communicate with someone, to find something out, whatever it is. And increasingly, I find that the process of translating those analog values into computable data corrupts, perverts, ignores, or distorts those starting values. With a game, the directionality is in a way reversed. And again, this is the romantic version of it. I fully acknowledge that there are definitely going to be counterexamples to this and other ways, and I'll get to some of those as well. But with a game, I willingly enter the game world and allow the game to tell me what my values are, what my motivation is, what my goals are. And because of that, you find, at least in the case of a good game, this kind of harmony, right? Between what I want and what I can do in the game. You take on, this is the Noen's argument of striving play, right? You take on the arbitrary goals and values of the game in order to experience the harmony of having your abilities commensurate to that. And this is where the boundaries then come into play, I think. Because for this harmony to work, there has to be some separation, at least conceptually, between when I take on these arbitrary goals and values and when I do not. And in this way, I'd argue that while games are, of course, a practice embedded in our lives and all the other systems and configurations that we're a part of and which impact upon us, games are also conceptually demarcated. We construct a game world as an other world, which includes not only the game as an artifact, so to say, but also the social relations and rules that we take on as a part of playing it. I think that viewing our engagement with games as a process of otherworlding or creating this other world helps us to understand why it is that we often perceive of games as separated from ordinary life, why I struggle in classes to not use the distinction between in-game and real life, even when we know they aren't, and what that's doing for us, what that might be doing for us. I think something that exemplifies this is in some of the backlash within gaming culture. I'm using a lot of these. It's not precise. This is the beginning of this project. In the backlash within gaming culture to things like microtransactions and battle passes and loot boxes. Because for me, I think in this framework, these can be understood as the encroaching of these more alienating forms of datafication into these game worlds that we have separated, where the purity of those initial game values and motivations become warped. They're guiding us not to follow the kind of values and goals of the game anymore, but to spending money or for engagement or doing something else, right? These mechanics are kind of permeating that boundary that we have put up between world and other world, if you like. The values and norms of the real world become impressed upon and begin to colonize the other world. And it links to something else that I'm working on right now, just as a teaser. This is my kind of current project. I think there's also something to this in the increasing trend of long-running MMOs like World of Warcraft and RuneScape opening these classic or vanilla servers. So my work on old school RuneScape, for example, it's often talked about within the player base as kind of in these quite escapist terms, quite explicitly, that what they didn't like about the direction the game was taking was the increasing use of microtransactions, the data-driven design decisions, and that they wanted a return to this older form of gaming that they perceive as purer, as more separated from the trends of datafication that supposedly pervade the rest of digital culture and, in their perception, gaming culture. We can, of course, think of this with regards to retro gaming as well, but I think there's something maybe particularly folkloric or otherworldly to this occurring in MMOs, because we know MMOs to be intrinsically, of course, social, but also ephemeral. They are to a great degree reliant on the transient communities of players who inhabit the world. But it's not only about that. The other world that is created and maintained is to some extent made in a negotiation between the players, the game as an artifact, and the developers, and what their relationship to it is. So what I find really interesting at the moment with old school RuneScape is how players talk about this, how they negotiate explicitly this idea of old schoolness, and how this is permeated through things like the in-game voting system, where any potential update has to be voted on by the player base, and you need a supermajority, 70% of yes votes for it to be implemented. So you have this, you have to have these kind of, the developers have to campaign for their own updates to be added to the game, and you get counter campaigns, and you end up with these very explicit discussions about what the direction of the game is and should be, and what the values behind the game are. So it's really interesting for that perspective. People say things like, oh, this doesn't feel old school, or we play this game to avoid updates like this. They talk about the game as this kind of separated oasis from the rest of gaming culture and digital culture. So yeah, again, that's just what I'm very early on, but hopefully it offers something a bit more kind of concrete in terms of this framework and how it might be applied to in terms of otherworlding and digital game communities. So I hope that made some sense. Like I say, I'm trying to triangulate between some moving targets here. Mainly what I wanted to do is introduce this idea of otherworlding into game studies and into this symposium, because I think that can be quite useful, to show a very early attempt at a way in which games can be viewed through this idea, and how that leads us in a different direction of analysis than others. And it's a kind of a way of analyzing it that I think quite neatly contextualizes games within our broader lives and social structures, but also acknowledges and takes seriously the fact that games typically are seen as in some way apart from ordinary life, and what that separateness, that spatial conceptual otherness might be doing for us. So yeah, I'll leave it there, and yeah, thank you very much.